Welcome everyone to Finding and Using Imagery in the GIS. This workshop is being brought to you by UC Riverside Library, and I'm Janet Reyes, the Geospatial Information Librarian, and happy to go over this content with you. I have a few housekeeping things to take care of before we get started with the presentation itself. One of them is to let you know that the workshop is being recorded, and after we get the captions edited, we should be able to put the recording of this workshop up on the library's YouTube channel in about a week, I'm guessing. So be on the lookout for that. If you have registered for this workshop, I have your email address, and because I have it, I'm going to send you a copy of the slides after this workshop is done. So be sure to check your inbox or your perhaps possibly junk mail for email from me. The slides contain a lot of links that you may find useful as you explore this topic further. So just wanted to provide that to you. If you are a UCR affiliate, you may be noticing that QR code at the bottom left corner of the screen. That's to help us track attendance for who comes to our workshops. So if you don't mind scanning that QR code, that would help greatly. I'm also going to paste in the chat now a link. So if you prefer following a link rather than scanning the QR code, that should work just fine. And let me think if there's anything else. I don't have a helper today, but I do have a pretty good view of anything that might be going on in the chat. So I will try to pay attention to that as I go along. I will be pausing at breaks between sections of this workshop, and I'll try to scan to see if there's anything I should respond to in the chat. But if somehow I blow past it, feel free to unmute yourself and let me know that you have a question or a comment. I think that's all the housekeeping we have, so let's proceed with the workshop. I'd like to start with the UCR land acknowledgement. We'd like to respectfully acknowledge our responsibility to the original and current caretakers of this land, water, and air, the Cahuilla, Tongva, Luiseno, and Serrano peoples, and all of their ancestors and descendants, past, present, and future. Today, this meeting place is home to many Indigenous peoples from all over the world, including UCR faculty, students, and staff, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on these homelands. So here's an overview of what this workshop will cover. We'll start out with some of the basic information you might need to know about aerial imagery. Then we'll take a look at how to think about what your needs are in terms of imagery and what information you can find out about imagery to make sure that your needs are being met as best as possible. We'll look at some sources of where to find aerial imagery. Then we'll take a look at how you go about adding imagery into a GIS. And I'm not sure all of you know, but a GIS is a geographic information system or a way to create maps using a computer. And then we'll look at ways of using imagery in a GIS. And I break these into two basic categories. One is using GIS tools and methods to do analysis and or feature extraction. And the other way is just people using their brains and looking at imagery and doing that feature extraction and then also assessment. And then finally, at the end, I have additional resources for you. There's going to be a few resource slides scattered throughout the workshop as we go, but then at the end, I have just a few additional resources for you. One thing I failed to mention at the housekeeping at the beginning was that towards the end, I'm going to paste a message in the chat that includes a link to a workshop assessment. Really appreciate it if you would just take a moment. It's an assessment where there's 3 questions. You just pick one of them to answer real quick. It'll help all of us for understanding whether this workshop has met your needs or if you have suggestions for other workshops or that kind of thing. So we'll appreciate it if you don't mind taking the time to do that. All right, so let's get started with imagery basics. So here's my very brief history of aerial imagery. I break it into 3 major advances. And of course, starting with the 1920s when there were airplanes. They came into use especially toward the end of World War I, but in the 1920s is when we started to see a lot of domestic use of air, airplanes that had a camera mounted to the bottom of the aircraft, pointing straight down at the ground. And as the plane flew along, somebody would be snapping photos as they went. So that enabled kind of continuous coverage of the ground frame by frame. The next big advancement was in the 1960s, where we had Earth observation satellites starting to be launched. Of course, this was a game changer because we're way up high, getting a much broader view in any one frame that was taken. Um, and all kinds of advancements in imaging technology as well. So another thing about the satellites is they have a fixed path that they travel around the Earth, so they can come back to the exact same spot once they've made an orbit, and they'll take an image of the exact same location on the Earth at that spot. So you have a very nice capability of monitoring the exact same area as each orbit is completed. So anyway, that's the 1960s. And then a more recent development is in the 2010s when the use of UAVs or drones really came into play. So drones can get to places where fixed wing aircraft and satellites cannot image as well, as they're so nimble, and they can create some really great imagery. So and that it also empowers people to go ahead and collect their own aerial imagery rather than contracting for somebody to go up and fly a plane or trying to arrange to grab some satellite imagery from somewhere. So again, really of a recent and powerful development in the history of aerial imagery. Let's take a minute to just think about the difference between maps and aerial imagery. On your left on this slide, this is a couple of blocks of city of Riverside, just to the west of our campus. And this is a Google Maps. You might be familiar with looking at that kind of a map, and you can see the kind of features it has. It has streets, many of them labeled. It has a few, uh, businesses labeled. It has a park, that kind of thing. But then look on the right at the same area in an aerial image. I think you would agree that the aerial image has lots more information on it than this map, which Google did a good job of extracting what they think most people need to know the most. But if you can take just a minute and reflect on what kinds of information could you extract from this image on the right that may not have been mapped by anyone else before, or not mapped and accessible to you. So if you want to put some ideas in the chat, that's fine. I'll just give it a few seconds, and then we can talk about some of the things that you might be able to map or extract just by looking at this image. Okay, well, a few things that you can see. I see green space by neighborhood, yes. Um, More broadly, you can tell things like, um, I'm seeing some really good input on the chat now. In addition to the green space, you can identify residential areas, buildings and parks, buildings, yes. You can pretty much tell maybe some of the different types of buildings, right? In the upper right, I don't think those are residential, but certainly on upper left, we have mostly residential. Um, Things like, I don't know if you can tell, but some of these buildings that are kind of like hollow squares, I think they have swimming pools in the middle. It's a light blue, so you could see how many swimming pools there are. If it was possible, we might be able to see how many of these places have solar panels. Um, I don't see a lot of trees on this, and that makes me think of there's a lot of studies right now about urban heat and how trees kind of mitigate some of the heat that we get in summer. And so that might be part of a study to analyze which neighborhoods in Riverside, might be heating up more in the summertime because they don't have that tree cover. So data center coming soon. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, there's a lot of information that you can extract from an aerial image that may not have already been mapped. And in fact, on this next slide, I have just a few of the use cases for imagery in a GIS, whether it's natural features or man-made features, whether it's resources that are being managed by humans, such as forestry or agriculture. If you're interested in history, if you have coverage of the same area over time, you can see how things developed. Certainly, there's military and national security applications, and there's even more. So this gives you an idea of like, I like aerial imagery because it can give so many different people interested in different areas some information that they wouldn't already have. This next slide might be a little scary for some of you who don't like to think about like physics and things like that, but I do feel the need to include it just to remind ourselves that an image captures what's in the part of the electromagnetic spectrum that's what we know as visible light, what our human eyes are capable of seeing. But there are different wavelengths in this spectrum, of course, and there are some things that can be sensed in either side, say, of the visible light spectrum. Like on the left-hand side on this illustration, we have the infrared. On the other side, we have ultraviolet. And there are some things that you can detect that aren't visible naturally to us, but if we just shift the sensor or the film type or whatever you want to call it a little bit to the left or to the right, now we can see things or understand things that we couldn't just in the visible light spectrum. And you'll know that there are several types of images that are called multispectral images, and these are the type that have captured the radiation reflectance in different bands, whether it's in the visible light or shifted to the left or to the right, or only some of the visible light bands. And we can, again, extract a lot of useful information just by dealing with that. Um, on this slide too, I want to mention the term remote sensing. It's something that you might often hear associated with the use of imagery in a GIS. These platforms, whether it's an airplane or a satellite or something flying over the ground, they can have cameras, which is what we use for imagery, but they can also have other types of sensors that detect other types of things, like maybe air pollution, particulates, heat, radiating off the ground, things like that. So remote sensing is a broader term that encompasses uh, imagery, camera imagery, but it also includes other types of ways of detecting information about the Earth's surface. So just wanted to throw that in there because this term does come up a little bit later in the workshop. Another slide that has some terminology for you is to think about the types of spatial data that we typically find in a GIS. There are several types, but these are the two big ones. On the left, we're talking about vector data. This is data that mimics what you would find on a hand-drawn map. So little tiny features would be represented as points. Of course, long linear features like streams or roads would be represented as lines, and then a different layer might have things that spread out over an area, and we call those polygons. That's vector data, and that's very common in a GIS. But on the right-hand side is where we are with the imagery because it's raster data, which means it's composed of all these little grid cells. I think we're probably all familiar with it from taking digital images or thinking about computer screens and things like that. We have a grid cell system called pixels. All pixels in a particular raster are the same size. And importantly, all pixels have a value assigned to them, a numerical value. And because they have a number assigned to them, that enables calculations are possible. So we will get into that a fair bit more later in the workshop. But that's an important thing about pixels that can show infinite variation across the surface, as opposed to vector, where you have maybe a category of stuff or a range like from 20 to 30% or whatever it is, but not individual square by square on what that actual value is. So we'll be dealing with raster data, and you'll see that term coming up later in the workshop as well. All right, so that's the end of the imagery basics. Now let's think about how imagery might be able to match the needs that you have for what you want to extract from it. But first, I want to give a preview of the imagery uses in a GIS. I kind of hinted at this earlier as well. two basic categories in my mind. One is using GIS tools and methods, also AI more and more, for doing things like extracting features from imagery and doing analysis, right? We have, again, those rasters have a number associated with them. We can do all kinds of calculations and things with those numbers. The other way that we use imagery is, again, by somebody using their brain and looking at the image and relying on their knowledge to be able to extract features and also assess features. We may not be able to do precise analyses, but we can characterize the features that we're looking at, just again from experience and knowledge and things like that. So keep that in mind as we're thinking about if you're going to be doing a project that will involve aerial imagery, you'll eventually have to decide on these kind of things, like what features are they that you want to extract or analyze? How big of an area, where is the area of interest and how big is it? What vintage of data do you need? Many times we want the latest and greatest, right? But sometimes having a historical perspective is good, or sometimes the very latest is not available to us. So we have to go back a little bit farther than we perhaps would like. You have to think about what scale range you're going to be looking at. Are you going to be zoomed way in to a very small area, or kind of looking at a national level or something in between? And related to that is the granularity of what you want to extract. So that works two ways. It's the actual physical size of the feature to be extracted. What's the smallest feature that you need to capture? And could your imagery recognize that or see that? Similar to feature size, we have to think about how precise we are going to get when we identify that feature. So for some projects, it might be good enough just to say, yeah, that's an urban area and this is not. For other projects, we need to get a little bit more granular and say, this is a building versus this area over here is a transformer for electrical distribution. And then sometimes we need to get even further down to that level of being able to say, this is a building and it's a gas station as opposed to this building over here, which is a hospital. So all of these things come into play when you're looking for imagery that's going to support the kind of information that you're going to be looking at. And so aerial imagery has its own parameters, as you probably would have figured out. And those are often described in a file or some kind of description that's called metadata, which is information about the imagery. And again, a lot of this parallels what we just saw on the last slide. So it should tell you how much or what parts of the world are covered in the imagery, what time it was acquired. The year is important. Sometimes even the time of year is important. Especially folks in this field, sometimes they talk about wanting leaf-off imagery. That would be in the Northern Hemisphere, that would be maybe like from late October to March, when most of the deciduous trees have dropped their leaves. And when that happens, you can see the ground, what's on the ground underneath the tree canopy a lot better than you could say in middle of summer. So sometimes that kind of consideration comes into play. Orientation, mostly when I think of aerial imagery, I'm thinking of the vertical orientation, which is like a 90-degree angle. If you dropped a line straight from the camera lens down to the ground, it would form a right angle. But there's also aerial imagery out there that is kind of looking off to the side as if you were looking out the window of an airplane, and that's called either oblique or bird's eye view. You can't map from that too well, but that often provides super helpful information that complements what you can see on the vertical drop straight down view. If you see the terms ortho or rectified, that just means that the distortion that would be in the image has been taken out so that it matches a map that's been precisely measured out and everything, that will match just fine. Scale or resolution, again, like what's that pixel size? What's the smallest feature that you can see on this image? And what scale was it originally captured at? Type of image matters. Here we're getting back into that electromagnetic spectrum a little bit with, it could be natural color, it could be color infrared, which is shifted just a little bit off band a little bit to the left on that illustration from earlier. Some imagery is multispectral, so there are several bands captured for one frame. And then, of course, panchromatic or black and white, you'll just be seeing shades of gray on those kind of images. Historical images, a lot of them will be black and white. And finally, we have to think about obstructions. Cloud cover can be a big deal in many parts of the world, especially if you're mapping, say, jungles or something like that, where there's a lot of cloud cover a lot of the time. And unfortunately, lately we've had massive wildfires, and I have seen imagery that was acquired downwind from where these fires were taking place, and it's really hard to see the features on the ground. So the satellites can't avoid taking their images. They've got their path and they're doing it whether there's smoke there or not. But just realize that sometimes what the satellites can capture may not be super clear at a particular time. And I want to put in a word about supplementary imagery. This is imagery that you're not going to be using as your main source, but it's really going to maybe help you figure out what you're seeing on your main source of imagery. So this could be imagery captured in different years or seasons. Maybe it's oblique instead of vertical. Maybe it's a different image type or visual band type of imagery. You can find existing supplemental imagery, of course, or you can acquire it yourself by flying a drone or going out and visiting the site and taking photos of whatever it is you're looking at. So just drilling down a little bit further on this idea of existing supplemental imagery, I wanted to mention that in Google Maps and Google Earth and Bing Maps, they could be helpful sources for you for supplemental imagery. For instance, all the three of those provide street views, which can be really helpful if you can't tell looking top down what a particular feature is. The Google products also provide crowdsourced ground photos, and these could be from a street, but they could also be somebody who's out in the backcountry and on a hike and taking photos. And maybe you're not going to be able to see what that looks like from a ground view any other way, except somebody else has been there and taken photos of it. And then also Google Earth and Bing Maps, they both provide oblique views. So you can either look at it top down or tilt the image and see what it looks like at an angle. So just wanted to throw that out there. I am going to take a quick pause before we get into sources of imagery. So if you had any questions you were thinking about or comments, this is a great time to put them in the chat. Okay, so now that we've thought of image parameters and that kind of thing, let's take a look at where we might be able to find some of these imagery that we could use in our project. First thing to know is that there are many types of raster file formats. Again, imagery is a subset of the rasters. The first bullet point shows you some of the file formats that we may all be familiar with just in general life, that there's TIFFs and there's JPEGs and other things. If you're ever on a website looking for aerial imagery and something is labeled as a GeoTIFF, that could be very, very helpful for you because a GeoTIFF already has the information in it such that when you bring it into a GIS, it'll plop down right where it's supposed to be on the map that the GIS provides. So if it's a regular TIFF, if it's not a GeoTIFF, but a regular TIFF, you're going to have to do that work to get the image aligned with the base map in the GIS. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But down toward the bottom of the slide, I'm just going to show you just some of the many image or file extensions that correspond to different types of imagery that you might come across, especially if you're using satellite imagery where the sensors often have different bands, again, of that electromagnetic spectrum. So some of these suffixes might help you, give you a tip on what kind of imagery you're going to be finding with them. And there's many, many other file formats. As I just wanted to contrast that briefly with the vector data. Remember, I mentioned the points, lines, and polygons. Typically, when we're looking at that for a GIS, it would be a shapefile or maybe a geodatabase, and that's about it. There aren't too many as file formats in the vector side of things. So raster has lots more. I'm looking at a question in the chat. Is there a consolidated database of multispectral image datasets? Great question. I've got some sources coming up that have a lot of them. I don't know if there's one that really stands out as a definitive source for that, but yeah, I hope some of the links that I'm going to show you in the slides ahead will be of help there. So if you want recent imagery, which many of us do, um, all of these sources also provide historical imagery up to a point. And what I'm trying to say there is they capture images pretty recently, like in 2025, and that was the latest at 2025, but now we're in 2026. So all of a sudden that becomes historical imagery, sort of, right? Like not super current, but maybe a year or 5 years old. So any of these sources that you see here will have the latest and greatest plus whatever they've already collected. They usually serve out to the public as well. This link is a link to an article that kind of lists, as the name implies, 15 satellite imagery data sources. Some of them are duplicated down here. Government agencies are a great place to look. At the federal level, we have a few sources. The state of California has a geoportal where you can find imagery among many other types of geospatial data. The European Union has its Sentinel satellite, so they've got imagery from that. Another category of sources for recent imagery are companies that's their job. They have satellites and they sell the imagery to you for a price. I listed Planet Labs, Nearmap, and Hexagon. These are three companies with which UCR at one point or another has had a license agreement where we could get those images from them. But yeah, so and there's many other vendors that are in the business of selling imagery. And then with GIS platforms themselves, these will both come up in later slides, but ArcGIS Living Atlas of the World works great with Esri products. It includes imagery along, again, with many other types of vector data and raster data. And then Google Earth Engine is a particular product of the Google Earth suite of things that has imagery, satellite imagery in particular, available in a catalog inside of it. And so while we're talking about acquiring recent imagery, of course, doing it using a UAV or a drone is one way to go about that for yourself. So if this would be a whole workshop and a half, all in itself. But I just wanted to give you some starting information about using imagery from drones. That article that I linked to at the top really seemed to be a nice summary for beginners about how it all works at a higher level view. In the middle of the slide, we have some information that the University of California has provided because there are many researchers at all of our campuses that are interested in using drones and might be getting started with it. So they need that information too. The next item down on the slide is guidance if you're going to use drones at UCR in particular. There's some safety considerations and things like that. Once you use a drone and capture imagery with it, that's great. But then what do you do with that imagery? How do you make it into something usable for you? So there are software that take care of that for you. And at UCR, we have a lot of ArcGIS products, and one of them is ArcGIS Drone to Map standard. So that's available at no cost to UCR affiliates. There's another software called Pix4D, and of course, as in most things, there are many other choices for that kind of thing. And now let's talk about historical imagery. So the definition of historical is a little fuzzy. I think most of us in the field would think of before the year 2000, we can consider historical maybe. So again, government agencies at various levels of, whether it's federal or state, I've looked at the California State Library and they have a category called aerial images or aerial photos. Mostly what I clicked through, they were oblique, that like kind of bird's eye view. So I don't know if they have any vertical images in there, but that might be worth exploring further. And this is a library guide from a different university that has state by state sources of where you can find imagery for that state. Um, as far as local information, you may not realize this, but flood control districts have often been in the business of acquiring aerial imagery that help them do their work in understanding where the risks are and what they should build up and things like that. So once they've acquired that imagery, typically for a pretty nominal fee, they will allow the public to come in and maybe get a copy of some of the imagery that they've acquired at the local level. So just keep that in mind if you're looking for older historical imagery of a particular local area. And then this next link is one of my recent favorites, the National Collection of Aerial Photography. It's coming out of Scotland, very heavy into, of course, coverage of the UK and also Europe, although they have other parts of the world as well. They have a great store of imagery from World War II, which is really fascinating. So anyway, that would be a great one to explore sometime if you're interested in history. Um, Academic libraries, a lot of us have historical imagery, also some public libraries, maybe like the bigger ones, like LA Public or New York Public Library. One subcategory of historical imagery that might be of interest is something called real estate atlases. So back in the day, again, maybe the late 20th century, realtors had these books that were an assemblage of uh, vertical aerial photography that helped them understand what the different neighborhoods were, what they were looking like at the time. Um, then they could map, which houses were for sale and things like that, or just understand where the recent development was. So that can be a source of information if that's the kind of thing you're looking for. Otherwise, a lot of museums have aerial photography, maybe not on display, but in the back. Historical societies, I have found that to be true, that several of them have acquired whatever aerial photography they could find. And then there's a few other applications as well, or services where you can find historical imagery. And just to amplify a little bit what I'm saying about academic libraries, um, with the UC libraries ourselves, um, here at UCR and at Santa Barbara, we provide uh, digital and physical accessibility to our aerial photo collection. And this screenshot on the right is we have our oldest aerial photography at UCR is 1938, and we have coverage of the area that is now campus. So this is a screenshot showing the center point of a photo from 1938 that covers where our current campus is. And in this case, we do have a digital version of this image that you can also hold in your hand, but if you wanted to just download it, you could do that from this app that we've created. Santa Barbara has an amazing collection. They're much, much bigger and they have just a ton of resources. So they are definitely a place to check out if you need to go, especially beyond our two-county area. And then for physical items, all of these campuses, UCLA, San Diego, and Berkeley, also Santa Cruz, I think, has some physical aerial photography that you hold and maybe take a picture of with your own camera if you wanted to. So anyway, all that is just to underscore that your academic libraries often have aerial photography available to you. All right, so we are doing pretty well for time. The next section is about how to add imagery to a GIS once you've found it. So I break it up into three basic scenarios. You might find individual images that you want to bring into a GIS. And like I said before, if they're not a GeoTIFF, then you'll have to do what's called georeferencing, which we'll talk about more on the next slide, to make sure that that fits right in with the map that you have available in your GIS. You might have a set of individual images that they overlap, but you just want to make one big image out of all those individual pieces. So that's called creating a mosaic. And there is software. One's called Open Drone Map. It has the word drone in it, but my understanding is you could use it even for historical aerial photos to mosaic individual images together to make one seamless big image. Um, but something that's often a method for bringing in imagery to a GIS is not to have a file that you load into the GIS, but to access a service that provides it to the GIS, either um, as a base map, which is like the underpinning of everything else you're doing in the GIS, or maybe a portion of the world where you can bring it in on top of your base map. So this is not stored locally. You access it through a URL. Things to know about this kind of service, though, is that it's stitched together from their best available sources. So at any particular place as you pan around, the imagery may change. It might have been collected at a different time than the area that was just half a mile to the left, kind of thing. Um, it might be at a different zoom level. You'll see a different image type. And it's really hard to find out for a particular, area that you're looking at and zoom level. Well, what is this imagery I am looking at right now? I have a link at the bottom that talks about for Esri products, they typically use world imagery as their base map. It's like world with a capital W. It's like a product. And that tells you how to go about finding that metadata about the image. But it's not obvious at all. So it's really information that you would not have come across otherwise without knowing, like there's a trick to it kind of thing. So here's what I'm talking about with georeferencing. The basic plan is to find really distinguishable features on both your image and then the map that you're trying to align it to. There's a tool that does this. So you find, say, a road intersection on your image, you click at that intersection, then you move over to your map and click that very same intersection. You try to spread your points around the image so that they're not all bunched up in one corner or another. And then that will kind of have the GIS do sort of a rubber sheeting so that the image will then fit as well as it can on your base map. So that's a skill and it's not a lot of fun for most of us. So again, those geotiffs are very valuable because that enables you to skip doing all of this work to get your image to align to the base map. Well, I've been mentioning a few of the GIS platforms so far without really going into it. And I just feel at this point is a great time for us to talk about some of the GIS platforms that are out there. I've mentioned ArcGIS a few times, ArcGIS Pro, ArcGIS Online. There's many other softwares, and they are all created by this company called Esri, which is also based in the Inland Empire. They are the industry leader, and these two products, ArcGIS Online and ArcGIS Pro, both allow you to have imagery base maps, and they also have tools for you to do analysis with imagery. Same is true for QGIS, which is a free and open source GIS desktop version. Then there's, in the Google side of things, there's Google Earth Pro, which is a desktop version, and Google Earth for web. Both of these come with multiple years of base map imagery, which is super valuable if you need to go back in time at all. The catch, though, with Google Earth is that you can only do visualization of the images. There's no analytical tools in these. So that is kind of made up for, though, in Google Earth Engine, which is a third version of Google Earth. Like I mentioned before, it has a catalog of satellite imagery in it already. Plus, it has the ability to do high-level analytics. It's mostly code-based. So it's not a tool that you click a button. It's like you have to have the code to make the analysis happen. And then, of course, there are other platforms, but these are the big ones. And I'll just show you that on the next slide, each of these has a totally different way of for a user to add individual images to their GIS. So this is nothing that you need to take notes on or anything, but it's just to show you they're not using the same terms. They're not using the same method. Here's this QGIS talks about raster. Um, this one talks about media layer. So again, it's not intuitive, and you do have to learn a little bit about what each platform calls things in order to do the same basic function. So you can imagine it gets even more complicated when we get to the analysis part as far as what they call it and where you would go in the GIS to find the tool to do the thing. So anyway, I could not, it would be great if I could just tell you this is how it works no matter what GIS you're using, but that's just really not the case. Um, so let's look a little bit more at these imagery as a base map. In ArcGIS, they have three that are ready to load that are image-based. And they also have something, I think I mentioned this on an earlier slide, called Living Atlas of the World that you can link into from ArcGIS Pro or ArcGIS Online. Among the many, many data sets they have a whole suite of imagery, including alternative base maps that are imagery. They have multispectral imagery. They have some that were acquired over time. And they even have a category called event imagery, which I imagine is things like before or especially after things like the wildfires, the hurricanes, some of those things where you really want to see the before and after. So they've got hundreds of choices. And if you're using Esri products, that would be a really valuable resource. In QGIS, it doesn't really come with imagery loaded in immediately, but what QGIS is famous for is having plugins that enable you to do specific things that it does not come with natively. And in this case, there are two plugins that can provide different imagery sources as a base map. And then I have at the bottom here, this doesn't make any sense at all unless you've already used QGIS, but another way to get imagery in there is to go to XYZ tiles and then click new connection. And if you know the URL for the service that provides the base map, you can insert it that way instead of going through the plugin. So again, just to show you how convoluted it can get sometimes. And then Google Earth Pro imagery is the base map. That's its shining feature. I wanted to show you just some of the things you can do with Google Earth Pro. Remember, I had on a few slides ago, like you have to go add image overlay to get a separate image into Google Earth Pro. They also have just a button you can push to do that. This icon with the backwards arrow over the clock is where you get to access the slider bar that shows you all the different vintages of imagery that you can be looking at. In this case, what I've done is take the same location in Moreno Valley, which is just south of our campus. This is an image from 1985, same place in 2023. I think you can see there has been change, a lot of change over time. So that's really super helpful. Also, this little icon here allows you to change the sunlight and sun angle of your view. So that's kind of fun to do for something like the Grand Canyon if you want to see where the shadows are as the sun goes down. It's kind of fun to play with that. So anyway, yeah, Google Earth is great for historical imagery in particular, and then some of the manipulations you can do with what you're looking at. So as I mentioned, I have resource slides scattered throughout, and this one is just a compilation of a few of the many guidances or tutorials or things like that about adding imagery to a GIS. Yeah, because it does vary so much platform to platform. And this is the tip of the iceberg, but hopefully it would get you started on some things. I'm seeing a message in the chat about something I had neglected to mention, which is there must be like a CRS or a coordinate reference system to you have to match up the projections and things like that in a GIS of how the Earth's curvature is being translated, both on in the GIS itself and the image that you're loading in. So that's a great point. It it could be something to look at. If things aren't working right, you might need to investigate that kind of thing, which gets very complicated and is not the subject of this particular presentation, but it can trip you up. Yeah. Okay, so finally we're getting down to how would we go about using imagery in a GIS? And again, I have it broken into two categories. The first category, like I mentioned before, is using tools to analyze and extract features. This screenshot is of the toolbox in ArcGIS Pro that allows you to use the tools that they have already created. So you can see some of the categories that we'll be talking about in the slides ahead. Change detection, we have deep learning, we have things like map algebra and math and statistics. Remember, those values associated with rasters make this kind of thing possible. So yeah, let's go ahead and dive in a little bit to some of the higher level categories that we have here. Like I said, change detection is something that you can compute because we have these numerical values associated with pixels. This image, I believe, is of an area outside of Phoenix. The top image is 1985. The bottom image is 2011. As you can probably imagine, something in this area that was an agricultural field in 1985 would have a different reflectance, right? A different pixel value than the same area now that it's all built up later on. So that's a great way that GIS can help quantify the amount and extent of change over time by doing those kind of calculations. Another type of numerical calculation is to come up with what are called spectral indices or a spectral index. And it sounds very technical and complicated, but really it's just an idea of we've got those different wavelengths in the spectrum. Different types of surfaces reflect that wavelength in different ways or different amounts. So we can do some pretty basic math in some cases to just get a way of understanding the qualities of what we're seeing on the Earth's surface. So one of the, at least in my experience, one of the most commonly known spectral indices or a spectral index is the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, or NDVI. This is a very common means of assessing vegetation health. And you can see the formula. It's not that complicated, really. If it's NIR is the near infrared, so you're subtracting it and adding it to the value in the red band, and that is a great way of assessing vegetation health. And my next slide has an example of that. This is looking at an algal bloom in a water body. So this image in the middle at top is the natural color image. Like if we were looking out of the airplane window straight down, we would see something like this. But if we then pull out the different bands and take the differences and so forth and divide them, a map can be produced that really highlights the extent of this algal bloom that would not be especially noticeable just from the natural color image. So, and of course, pixel values of that calculation can be represented on a map. So that's just one example of the kind of ways that imagery can really help us understand our world. Another category is image classification. This has been around for a while. Basic idea is that those pixels have values, and no surprise, perhaps, that the values represented in some pixels typically come from a particular type of ground cover. So there are two basic ways of approaching image classification. If it's supervised, that means that the pixel data has been correlated to known ground cover in this area. And then now that they have another image with unknown ground cover, they can be fairly confident that they know what the ground cover is just based on what the pixel data was from this other area where they did have that knowledge. The unsupervised just means we're finding pixels that have spectral similarities. We're not sure what it is, but we go out in the world afterwards and find out Oh, that's what that is. This is a water body, and this is a road and things like that. So uh, that's a very gross generalization of what image classification is. I've got a link here where you can learn more about it. Um, and this illustration shows how they've been able to categorize certain types of land cover based on what the pixel values were in this multispectral image at the top. So yet another category is a more recent development. We're talking about deep learning now, which is a subset of artificial intelligence. Um, Basic idea here is that there's an algorithm and it is fed, probably to do a good job, it's fed thousands of sample images that have a particular type of feature, like a car, or a solar panel, or roads. And then you feed it the 3001st image and ask it, can you find the car or the whatever on this image if there is one? So this has improved over time. The illustration on the screen shows three deep learning packages that Esri provides. So you can use this, your pre-trained packages, or you can also tweak them if the results that you're getting aren't as great as you would like. You can, manipulate some of the outcomes, possibly, and of course, have your own algorithm and feed it imagery that's local to the area that you're interested in and see if that will do any better. So, um, yeah, so this is, I'm sure it's going to be developed more and more as time goes by and become more accurate. Um, but this was super helpful. This type of technology I know was used in the aftermath of the big fires we had in Los Angeles a year ago. They were able to quickly identify which buildings had partial or total damage from something like this. So um, super helpful technology. So here are some resources for using those imagery or raster tools in a GIS. Again, wide variety of approaches. Different platforms do it differently, but hopefully some of these links would help you get started. And I'm going to wrap up with talking a little bit about the old school way of doing things, manual feature extraction and assessment, um, which is where a human looks at the image, has background knowledge, applies that knowledge to what they're seeing on the image, and makes delineations. In this case, this is a vegetation map um, where a person drew these boundaries, differentiating one vegetation community from another. And this is showing, this was a ground photo taken at this location. Um, so this has value even in the world of artificial intelligence and tools that will do lots of great things, but there is still a place for image interpretation. And here are some of the use cases for sticking with basic image interpretation. Um, Accuracy tends to be higher um, in a lot of cases. What I've heard anecdotally, I don't have direct feature values, but I know that image interpretation with people who have been trained well at it can approach 90 to 95% accuracy, whereas the same thing done with image classification, it might be in the 75 to 85% range. So if that higher accuracy is important, you might want to go the image interpretation route. Again, because people with their brains can use nuanced decision making about applying information from other data sources, applying local knowledge. Um, they can compensate more readily, perhaps for poor quality in the primary image source by using supplemental imagery or things like that that might not be built into the plan for image classification and things. Sometimes the team that's working on the project just doesn't have the technology or expertise to use the tool-based features. Maybe the project scope is very localized, so doing it, with people rather than with tools it just makes more sense. And then also, if you're mapping adjacent to areas that have previously been mapped using image interpretation, you want to make that whole seamless as possible, make it consistent as possible. So there is there are a couple links here at the bottom to previous workshops I've given talking about aerial photo interpretation that might be of interest if you are not so familiar with that approach. Finally, I think image interpretation can be used in conjunction with tool-based methods. Like somebody has to select those training samples that you're feeding the algorithm, like thousands and thousands of examples. They have to be able to recognize this photo has this type of feature. And then on the back end, quality assurance, right? They can do a quality check, and where they find problems, they can apply their local knowledge to make the corrections. They can clean up errors in the product. Like I've heard some anecdotes again that sometimes if there are shadows on the image, the tool or whatever will think that they are water bodies rather than actually shadows. So that kind of error would have to be cleaned up by somebody. And a human is a good person to do that. And then also, if there does seem to be a problem with the deep learning, humans can decide what criteria should be tweaked or updated for selecting those training samples that are being fed into uh, the algorithm. So with that, I want to paste the second thing into the chat that includes the link to the assessment. As I'm also sharing these additional resources, these are all tutorials and guides from Esri, so the ArcGIS products. They have done a great job at creating these kind of objects. I mean, there are similar things for QGIS, but they're more scattered. They're more like an individual does one here or there. It's not as a coordinated effort to educate than what Esri has provided. So that's why I'm focusing on the Esri products. And at UCR, these are the products and these lessons are all available to us free of charge. So we are just about at time. Oh, I did have this one extra slide. If you are interested in to know what kind of use imagery, aerial imagery is being put to at UCR. Well, first of all, right now, there is this environmental science course in spatial analysis and remote sensing being taught this spring quarter, but that should come around again. So if you're interested and you're a student, you might want to keep a lookout for the next time this is being offered. There is now a geospatial analysis minor in the School of Public Policy that includes some image interpretation or image analysis. There are at least 2 centers and probably many more on our campus that whose research involves using imagery to learn more about our environment. And finally, we have a library, and our library has books in it. So I did a search on our catalog just for the last 20 years of books that have something about satellite imagery, and I found 3,000. So we've got a lot of information for you if you want to do more reading. At the very bottom, I've put in this box, if you're really interested in it, you want to get into it more, an organization you might think about joining is the American Society of Photogrammetry and Remote Sensing, or ASPRS. If you're a student, membership, I think, is $50 a year. And one thing I noticed about students is that they have a ton. They have at least a dozen scholarships available for students. So if this is something you're interested to pursue, you might want to think about joining this organization. And now we're done, and it's almost been an hour. So I thank you for your attention. If there's any questions from any of you, I can stay on the call to try to answer them. But otherwise, again, look for the slides coming to you via email, and then look for the recording of this workshop in about a week or so on the library's YouTube channel.